A blind black girl sits at an old piano in a dim school gym. No spotlight, no applause, just silence. The judges barely look up. But when her hands touch the keys, something happens that no one expects. Her music doesn't follow rules, it rewrites them. What begins as an overlooked audition becomes a worldwide awakening. Who is this mysterious girl who plays as if the notes were memories, not melodies? And why does the world fall silent to listen? Stay with us, because what you're about to hear isn't just music. It's a story that will echo deep in your soul. Get her off the stage, she's black. The words rang out, sharp, cold, and final, spoken not by a stranger but by a legend. A public insult from the lips of Nathaniel Royce, one of the most revered names in classical music. He wasn't just questioning her ability. He was erasing her existence. But what the world nearly missed that night was a miracle. Ayanna Bell didn't flinch. The 15-year-old girl stood alone in the spotlight of Boston's Harmonic Theater, silent, invisible, but unshakable. She said nothing. Instead, she let her fingers speak. And when they touched the keys, the world stopped breathing. This isn't just a story about a girl playing the piano. It's about how a blind child, black, unknown, and unwelcome, transformed rejection into resonance. It's the birth of a movement, played not with words, but with heart. The Harmonic Theater glowed under crystalline light, its stage as polished and imposing as a temple. This was where greatness was expected, not interrupted. Tonight the audience was a sea of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos, donners, patrons, critics. They came to witness perfection at the International Symphony Night dress rehearsal. But instead, they witnessed disruption. From behind the velvet curtain emerged a figure most hadn't seen and certainly didn't expect. A slender teenage girl in a plain black dress. Her skin a deep warm brown. In one hand she carried a white cane. To many in the room that cane symbolized limitation, but to her it was something else entirely. A compass, a scepter, proof that she had learned to see with the soul. Ayanna Bell. No fame, no representative, no invitation, just raw, untouched courage. She stepped forward with the quiet poise of someone who knew every step was a test. Her free hand hovered above the Steinway & Sons D 274 grand piano, not yet touching it, just breathing in its presence. And then came the voice that shattered the moment like a hammer through stained glass. Get her off the stage, she's going to ruin the piano. The crowd turned, startled. It was Nathaniel Royce himself, America's coldest virtuoso. His tailored black suit glistened under the lights, silver hair immaculate, every inch the icon of elite music. But his words were anything but elegant. She's blind. My God, who let some unknown blind black kid near a $150,000 Steinway? This isn't a charity gala. The murmurs began. A cough, a chuckle from backstage, a few diverted gazes. No one stood up, no one pushed back. The silence in the hall became its own kind of betrayal. But Ayanna didn't turn away. She lifted her chin, her clouded eyes seemingly locked on Royce's icy stare, though she couldn't see him. Her grip on the cane did not tighten. Instead, she moved forward. One step, then another. She walked into the fire. With a grace born from 100 dark rooms and 1,000 lonely hours, Ayanna found the piano bench. She faced the audience, paused, and sat. Nathaniel Royce rose from his chair, nearly knocking over his wineglass. "Do not let her play. This will be a disaster." But Ayanna no longer heard him. She didn't need to, because what lived in her fingers was not vengeance. It was memory. Trained not in conservatories, but in the echoing halls of an underfunded orphanage. Her hands had known broken keys, missing pedals, out-of-tune chords. But they had also known love. She raised her hands, hovered, touched. The first note came like a whisper, a breath drawn against the chaos. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even confident, but it was pure, sharp, clear. It cut through centuries of silence like sunlight through prison bars. And the theater, once filled with noise and judgment, grew still. In that single moment, no one knew her name. But they would never forget what she had done. Because Ayanna Bell did not play for applause. She played to remind the world how to listen. Not with eyes, not with titles, but with the heart. The first sound under Ayanna Bell's fingertips that night wasn't just music. It was the echo of a journey no one in that glittering auditorium could imagine. It was forged in silence, carved in darkness, and shaped by solitude. 2 years earlier, on a gray winter afternoon in Hartford, Connecticut, a weathered social service van creaked to a stop outside the Eastbrook Conservatory of Music. The building loomed like a marble temple, reserved only for the children of privilege, prodigies groomed by diplomats, composers, and recording magnates. And out stepped Ayanna Bell, 13, black, blind since birth, orphaned at 3. She carried a frayed suitcase, a cracked braille reader, and a white cane held together with duct tape. There was no one waiting for her. She wasn't on the official student list. Eastbrook had quietly enrolled her through a feel-good initiative called the Silent Observers Program, a name that sounded noble but in truth meant isolation. It allowed her presence without participation. No classes, no recitals, no access to instruments. Ayanna became a ghost among royalty. While the sons and daughters of Grammy winners glided through halls in silk and cashmere, she moved like a whisper, hugging the walls, her presence an inconvenience. She didn't speak, she didn't knock. Instead, she found a spot outside room 2B, where Professor Harold McCain lectured on harmonic analysis. She couldn't see him, but she learned his rhythm, how he tapped the chalkboard with his left hand when explaining Bach, how his footsteps shifted when he disapproved of his student's performance. She memorized sonatas not with notes but with muscle memory, tracing melodies onto her thigh as others played inside. She counted time by listening to shoes walk out in 3/4 tempo. In her tiny dorm, tucked in the back building reserved for unofficials, she traced the walls to recall the echoes of her day. But it wasn't just the isolation that shaped her. It was the complicity. The silence, the way no one told her to leave, but no one ever welcomed her either. The way doors clicked shut when she passed. The way eyes never met hers. Once, she accidentally walked into the gym after dark. A white student, Colton Devereux, the senator's son, saw her and barked, "When did we start letting in pets?" Laughter erupted like thunder. Ayanna said nothing. She gently placed her hand on a piano nearby, then turned and walked away. But that moment, that cruel little joke stung more deeply than any wound she had ever known. Even Janice Kettering, the dorm manager, offered her version of subtle cruelty. "Ayanna, dear," she'd whisper, "this is a prestigious school. Don't make people uncomfortable." That word, uncomfortable, wasn't shouted, it wasn't angry, but it cut like glass, smooth, invisible, deadly. And yet, Ayanna didn't rage. She retreated deeper into her mind, but she did not give up. She listened harder. She noticed that the gym's wooden floor sagged at beat 44, that the second floor's acoustics favored low notes, that the vibrations through her cane could help her see the piano bench before she even touched it. She began composing in silence, no teacher, no sheet music, no Steinway, just her mind. Then, one night, everything shifted. It was after a lecture by Professor McCain. The students had left, chattering about Carnegie Hall invitations and recording contracts. Outside, the rain was falling hard, blurring the golden lights of the campus. The elite of Eastbrook gathered in the lounge below, sipping hot cider and comparing scholarship offers. But on the second floor, just beyond the corner of the hallway, a soft light spilled from room 2B. There, in the stillness, Professor McCain paused. He had returned to collect a forgotten folder, but what he saw rooted him in place. Ayanna was there. sitting cross-legged against the wall, hands raised in the air, her fingers dancing through invisible chords. She wasn't playing, she was remembering. Each note imagined, each beat counted on her fingertips. Music she had never seen, but understood better than many who had. Harold McCain didn't speak at first. He watched. In that moment, the truth became clear. This girl did not need sight to follow the path. She was already on it. Finally, he stepped forward and spoke, his voice low and resonant, like the opening phrase of a cello concerto. "Did you listen to the lecture?" Ayanna flinched slightly. Her cane tipped sideways, but she didn't reach for it. She simply nodded. "I'm trying to visualize the fugue," she answered. Soft, honest, unashamed. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a truth so vulnerable it pulled at the strings of his heart. Harold sat down beside her on the wooden steps, both of them facing the dark window speckled with rain. They listened to the storm in silence. Then he turned to her and said, "Don't apologize. Let's play." It was the first invitation Ayanna had ever received at Eastbrook. No announcements, no fanfare, just a quiet sentence. From that night on, their lessons took place not in the grand concert hall, but in a forgotten basement room that smelled of old sheet music and lemon wax. No Steinway, no formalities, just an upright piano and two people with a reverence for sound that went deeper than performance. And that, more than talent, more than tragedy, is how Ayanna Bell learned to command the keys. The basement smelled of aged wood and forgotten music, a scent that seemed to cling to the walls like a ghost. Mold lingered on the piano's edges, a quiet testament to years gone by. And yet in that dim room there were only two souls, a girl who was never listed as a student, and a professor who had once been crowned a genius. Harold McCain didn't teach Ayanna using formal theory. He told stories. A fugue, he said, was like a soul chasing itself through time. A major chord could feel like a landslide if it followed the wrong kind of goodbye. He tapped her knee gently, showing her how to rest her fingertips just so she could feel the strings vibrate through the wood, through her skin. He taught her that music wasn't just about accuracy. It was about breath, sorrow, light, and shadow. Dissonance wasn't sadness. It was what happened when the light faded before we were ready. And Ayanna? She absorbed everything like dry earth drinking rain. No repetition, no confusion. She never needed to be told twice. But what stunned Harold the most wasn't her phenomenal memory or speed of learning, though both were nearly supernatural. It was her reason for playing. Ayanna didn't perform to impress. She played to survive, to speak, to exist. For her, music wasn't a skill. It was the only language this world hadn't stolen. When spring came and the trees outside the gym unfurled their first bright green leaves, Harold McCain did something he had never done in more than 4 decades at Eastbrook. He wrote a recommendation letter. It wasn't for a student with a pedigree or a donor's last name. It was for Ayanna Bell, 15, blind, nameless in their records. He submitted her for the Young Virtuoso Showcase, one of the most prestigious auditions in the Northeast. In the letter, he didn't mention her blindness. He didn't bring up race. He didn't write about her overcoming odds. He simply said, "Ayanna Bell speaks music as a first language. Everyone else is learning it as a second." But Harold had forgotten something essential. Eastbrook didn't read music. Eastbrook read files. And Ayanna's file lacked everything that mattered in those marble halls. No family portrait, no prestigious last name, no SAT scores, no foundation letterhead. To Eastbrook, her file was silent before it even spoke. Because the school had its own quiet, brutal rule. Talent was a requirement, but lineage was the passport. And while students with names like Whitman, Langford, and Devereux studied counterpoint on imported linen paper, Ayanna learned it by feeling the vibration of a misplaced pedal, or by memorizing the breeze that fluttered across the second-floor hallway when someone played in D minor. Down in that neglected basement, Harold taught her lessons no syllabus could contain, and more importantly, he began to relearn music through her eyes, through her ears, her fingers, her breath. He didn't give her sheet music, no metronome, no homework. Instead, he tapped her wrist in rhythm, softly, like Morse code, between kindred spirits. Long, short, pause. Each tap was a word, each rhythm a sentence. He taught her syncopation not by counting but by feeling, the way a note sat differently in the lungs when it struck at the wrong moment in the right phrase. D isn't always D, he once whispered. Sometimes it's a waterfall, sometimes it's a sob that never reaches your throat. And Ayanna never interrupted, never questioned. She didn't need to. She learned through sensation, through the subtle tightening of skin, the shift of muscle, the echo in her pulse. What sent shivers through Harold's spine wasn't that she played correctly. It was that she played honestly. One night Harold described a fugue by Bach as a man chasing his own shadow through the labyrinth of time. Ayanna nodded quietly and then, without a word, played it back. Not perfectly, not by tempo or textbook, but she played the story. And for the first time in decades Harold felt ashamed of how he had once taught music as if it were arithmetic. But as Ayanna's quiet brilliance began to shine, the shadows around her deepened. The faculty lounge became a nest of whispers. I heard McCain's tutoring that girl in secret. She's not even a real student. It's irresponsible. If she performs, it could ruin the school's image. The resistance sharpened when Clarence Langford, head of the piano department and once thought to be Royce's artistic heir, called Harold into his office. Polished wood, framed diplomas, the smell of bitter tea and cold rules. Langford leaned back in his chair, his voice measured but firm. I know you believe in your project, but Eastbrook is not the place for experimental compassion. And just like that the line was drawn. A line between legacy and authenticity, between spotlight and silence. And yet, the girl who had never been invited into the room was already on her way to turning the whole building into an instrument. Biddy. Such a small word, yet it lands like a slap across the soul. Harold didn't argue. He didn't defend. He just smiled faintly and walked away. Ayanna never knew about those closed-door meetings or whispered warnings. She simply kept listening. But by then she wasn't playing what Harold had taught her. She had begun to play the things Harold never said aloud. She played his silence, his regret, the weight of a man who had once stood at the summit of acclaim, only to realize the world had clapped for his technique but never heard his truth. During one lesson, Ayanna began to improvise. No one asked her to. She just knew it had to happen. She opened with a suspended chord, then fractured it with a low, jagged bass, like the sound of footsteps cracking across thin ice. Harold stood there, motionless. He didn't realize his cheeks were wet until a tear touched the back of his hand, because in that moment he understood. She wasn't just learning from him, she was healing him. And that, perhaps more than her skill, was what drove him to send her name, quietly, without fanfare, to the most prestigious audition of the year, the Young Virtuoso Showcase. The application was unlike any the committee had ever received. No last names of donors, no glossy headshots, no biographies peppered with honors, just one audio file, one anonymous piece, recorded in a basement during a storm. A nameless melody, with no tempo and no polished transitions. But to Harold it was raw truth. And in a world where perfection often drowned out authenticity, that truth felt sacred. In his brief note he wrote only, Ayanna Bell, age 15. She doesn't read music, because she heard it before anyone ever wrote it down. A few weeks passed in silence. Then the school sent a reply. Ayanna was granted an audition, but not in the concert hall, not under the crystal chandeliers or with a panel of renowned judges. No cameras, no audience. They scheduled her at 7:45 a.m. in the small gymnasium below the east wing. The piano? An upright relic with a crooked left pedal. The judges? A single man in wire-framed glasses who looked more interested in paperwork than performance. It wasn't an invitation, it was a polite rejection in disguise. That morning Ayanna woke at 5, She skipped breakfast. She didn't speak. She sat quietly, tracing the edge of her old suitcase with her fingers, as though retracing every place she'd ever been invisible. Harold walked beside her in silence. At the door, he gently took her hand, cold and small, and whispered, "This isn't about whether they choose you. It's about whether you need them to." When the door creaked open, fluorescent lights flickered above. The room was bare. The piano creaked in protest as she approached it. No introductions, no instructions, just one nod from the judge, who looked at his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. Ayanna placed her cane to the side, sat down, and rested her hands on the keys like she was touching an old scar. Then she began to play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, a piece not just demanding in technique, but nearly impossible without emotional mastery. Others practiced it for years. Ayanna had only heard it, on a fuzzy recording, alone in the dark. She'd listened to it over and over on an old radio, drawing every note into memory like sketching on glass. That morning, her right hand painted, her left hand told the story. She closed her eyes, not because she was blind, but because the music demanded no witnesses. It spoke only to those willing to hear with something deeper than ears. And when the final note faded into the stale air, the room was silent. No applause, no thanks, just the judge's pen scratching a few words onto a clipboard before he stood up and left. The door slammed behind him with a cold finality. Ayanna remained seated for a few extra seconds, not to be seen, not to be acknowledged, just to listen to herself, to the silence, to ask a question only her soul could answer. Did I say what needed to be said? What she didn't know was that down the hallway, half hidden in the shadows near the maintenance room, stood Mr. Richard Burrs, the conservatory's gatekeeper. He wasn't a music expert, but he had once polished the stage where Duke Ellington rehearsed. He had adjusted the lights when a young prodigy named Royce first played Carnegie cadenzas at Eastbrook, and in that quiet gym, he had just heard something truer than anything that had ever echoed through those marble halls. Without thinking, Mr. Richard pulled out his old phone from his janitor's coat pocket. No script, no zoom, no filters, just raw footage. The final 3 minutes of Ayanna Bell's performance. The title was plain. Blind Black Girl Auditions Inside Room Brings Rachmaninoff to Life. That night, he uploaded the video to a Forgotten Musicians forum he'd joined back in the early 2000s. No hashtags, no pitch, just so the world wouldn't forget what it tried not to see. The next morning, Ayanna received an email from the selection committee. "We appreciate your effort. Unfortunately, you are not on this year's roster." No feedback, no comment, no invitation to try again. But what the conservatory didn't know was that by trying to silence her, they had unknowingly turned up the world's volume. Harold received his own rejection, tucked neatly into a 2-line email, cold, clinical, dismissive. He printed it out, folded it in half, and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk. He didn't tell Ayanna. She didn't ask, because sometimes silence is how the world hides from the truth it fears to face. But this silence wouldn't last long. 3 days later, Mr. Richards' video, grainy, heartfelt, and filmed on a shaky hand, was quietly posted to YouTube. The blind black girl rejected by the conservatory plays Rachmaninoff from memory. The views trickled in, dozens, then hundreds from the old-school classical music community. The comments were gentle at first. "Sounds a bit raw, but she plays with feeling. Where's this kid from? Who posted this?" Then something unexpected happened. An Argentine pianist named Marcos Viala, famous for performing with one hand after a tragic accident, shared it on his page with one caption: "I cried. I haven't cried over music in 10 years. Within hours, a Berlin music blogger tweeted, "If Eastbrook didn't see her, then the problem isn't in her eyes, it's in theirs." Suddenly, what started as a whisper became a wave. No PR campaign, no viral hook. Just one thing that couldn't be denied: truth. People didn't just view the video, they watched it, they listened. Yuki Sakamoto, a deaf artist in Japan who feels music through vibrations against his jawbone, shared it with the caption, "She doesn't need to see the keys to touch me. I don't need to hear clearly to feel her cry with her hands." Within 72 hours, the video hit 3 million views. By the end of the week, music publications around the world asked the same question. Who is Ayanna Bell? Why was she never given a real chance? What kind of school would leave this kind of brilliance buried in a basement? Suddenly, Eastbrook was no longer trending for its artist alumni. It was in headlines for all the wrong reasons. Discrimination, bias, legacy over talent. Discrimination, bias. At an emergency board meeting, Clarence Langford pounded the table. This is just an online sensation. She plays by instinct, no technique, no trained harmony. The media is exaggerating. But the school's communications director, pale and wordless, quietly turned her laptop toward the board. On screen, a single tweet from the International Academy of Music glowed. "We watched the video. We want Ayanna Bell to open this year's World Harmony Festival." The silence in the room was colder than the Eastbrook corridors Ayanna once wandered alone. Langford scoffed. If she performs, who could possibly follow that? No one answered. Because they all understood the truth. If Ayanna Bell found her voice, there would be no one after her. In a modest apartment just outside Boston, Harold McCain stared at his weathered laptop. His hands trembled as he read the official announcement. Ayanna Bell, opening act World Harmony Music Gala. He didn't cry. He just closed his eyes and whispered, "No more waiting for invitations." That same morning, in a small, sunlit room with no curtains and no crowd, Ayanna sat quietly at the table. A thick envelope lay in front of her, delivered by courier from New York. She traced her fingers over the raised Braille letters. Invitation to perform International Gala of Human Harmony. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Her heart already knew. This time the world was the one asking her to speak. The International Gala of Human Harmony was held at Crescendo Hall in New York City, a concert hall where legends like Lang Lang, Alicia Keys, and Yo-Yo Ma had once stood beneath blazing lights. Broadcast to over 60 countries, the event celebrated the year's theme, Breaking Barriers Through Sound. On the lineup, Ayanna Bell, opening soloist. The performer following her? Nathaniel Royce. Yes, that Royce, the classical icon. The man who once stood under chandeliers, pointed at her, and declared she didn't belong near a Steinway. When Royce saw the final program, he nearly crumpled it. A blind, black teenager? This is a gala, not a street corner opera. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The entitlement dripped like oil. Judith Carr, his longtime advisor, whispered, "This is the organizers' decision. Her video passed 30 million views. They want an icon." Royce narrowed his eyes. They want a symbol, or they want ticket sales. At the final rehearsal, he stormed toward Gerard Monroe, the refined Frenchman directing the gala planner of presidential concerts, architect of musical magic. "I want the order changed," Royce demanded. "I will not perform after her." Gerard didn't flinch. "You may withdraw, Mr. Royce, but she will not." And for the first time in years, fear, not shame, slipped into Royce's eyes. He wasn't afraid of Ayanna. He was afraid of what she represented, that everything he'd ever hoarded, status, control, legacy, was unraveling, not by force, but by truth. Elsewhere, in a quiet suite on the 17th floor of a hotel, Ayanna stood alone by the window. No assistants, no stylists, no entourage. Just the hum of New York traffic below, like a restless orchestra tuning itself. Harold stood behind her, holding a simple black dress. No sequins, no jewels. She touched it, then smiled. "It doesn't need to sparkle, it just needs to sound right." Harold nodded. "Tonight they'll hear you differently." She turned, not with her eyes, but with her presence. Not through their pride, through what they've forgotten, their hearts. And that night, as the velvet curtain rose at Crescendo Hall and the screen displayed, opening performance, Ayanna Bell, United States. A girl who had once been silenced stepped into the light. And she didn't come to retaliate. She came to resurrect everything the world tried to bury. And then came the climax. The moment Ayanna shattered everything the classical world thought it knew. Her left hand grounded the melody in a heavy seventh chord, but her right hand struck a dissonant, deliberately wrong note. Out of key, out of tradition, yet painfully right. It wasn't music, it was a reckoning. A punch to every person who once smirked at her posture, at her presence, at her very right to sit on a stage like this. Then she stopped. No final flourish, no closing cadence, just silence, clean, absolute. No one moved, no one dared. Nathaniel Roy stood still at the wing, but the cold calculation in his eyes had melted. He no longer saw a blind black girl sitting at his piano. He saw himself, a mirror reflecting what he had long since buried: emotion, truth, purpose. "She doesn't read music," he whispered. No memorized fingerings, no printed scores, no layers of ego. What she offered was something he hadn't touched in years, the original fire. The purity before performance became product. Then the director stepped forward, tentatively breaking the spell. "Ayanna, was that your performance for the gala?" She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a quiet smile. "No," she said softly, "that was just a warm-up." Royce didn't ask to change the order anymore, because he knew. The one who opens the night is the one who stays in the audience's soul. That evening, Crescendo Hall didn't blaze with artificial grandeur. It breathed. The lighting was soft, almost reverent, like the stage itself had surrendered to the moment. The announcer's voice rang out gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the opening act of the Human Harmony Gala. From the United States, Ayanna Bell." No drums, no trumpets, no grand string overture. Just the tap of a white cane on the wooden floor, light, steady, echoing like time slowing down to let something sacred pass. Ayanna entered the stage as if gliding through the space between night and dawn. No glitter, no bare shoulders, no designer shoes. She was barefoot. The black dress she wore was simple, threadbare in places, because she didn't come to sparkle, she came to speak. In her left hand the white cane, in her right an old wooden flute, cracked and worn, the only thing her mother had ever left behind. Not because it was valuable, but because it had once soothed her to sleep when her world had gone dark. She didn't bow, she didn't wave, she simply sat, because every seat in the house, she believed, should have been saved for the forgotten. And then, with no conductor, no nod, no cue, she placed the flute beside her and touched the piano keys, not to perform, but to open a door. She didn't play Chopin, she didn't choose Beethoven, she didn't need Mozart to validate her. She played something wordless, a story that only her soul could tell. The first note was a sigh, not one of weakness, but of recognition. The melody that followed came in fragmented minor chords, like lullabies left unfinished. Her left hand carried weight. Slow, deliberate, like the long, lonely footsteps she had taken down the echoing Eastbrook halls. Her right hand caressed the high notes, like someone brushing against old wounds. The hall fell utterly still. Ambassadors, critics, billionaire patrons who had treated the gala like a fashion showcase suddenly sat like school children, learning to listen for the very first time. And then they cried, not because she was blind, not because she was the first black girl ever to grace that stage. They cried because for the first time someone wasn't playing at them, but for them, not to dazzle, but to confess, to connect, to say, "You're not alone." Halfway through, Ayanna's hands lifted from the keys, and without a word she reached for the flute. She didn't stand, she didn't pose, she simply tilted her head toward the gentle breeze coming from the wings, and began to play. It wasn't a melody, it was a memory. A whisper from the past that vibrated like a child's voice calling from another room. Fragile, trembling, full of hope. And somehow, in that fragile breath of wood and wind, the entire theater stopped breathing. Behind the curtain, Royce clutched the arm of his chair, knuckles pale, not from rage, but from realization. He had no argument, no vocabulary for what he had witnessed. Because Ayanna's music wasn't perfect. It was true, and the truth doesn't need defense. As the final note faded into silence, not as an ending, but as a sacred pause, she lowered her flute and raised her face. Not to see, but to feel. No one stood at first. Because they weren't reacting, they were re-evaluating. What just happened? Why does my heart feel seen? And then one person rose, then another, then all. Not for ceremony, but for penance. For the years they had stayed silent in the face of voices like hers. Backstage, Harold McCain wiped nothing from his face. He let the tears fall freely and whispered, "A girl they never invited just made the world stand up." The morning after the gala, headlines stretched from New York to Tokyo. A musical earthquake. Ayanna Bell's performance is not a recital, it's a wake-up call. She didn't just play, she testified. The new voice of the 21st century has no eyes but sees what we don't. The video, uploaded to the official gala channel, hit 5 million views in 24 hours. Comments flooded in, interview requests, global press, record deals. But Ayanna didn't answer. She didn't post. She didn't leave the hotel room. She sat silently at the wooden desk in her modest suite, hands tracing the shape of invisible piano keys, playing it all back from memory. 3 days later, there was a knock on her door. A representative from Silver Sound Records, the iconic label that had worked with legends like Herbie Hancock and Renee Fleming, stood outside, suit pressed, eyes wide, contract in hand. But Ayanna didn't rush to greet him. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for approval. She was waiting for the music to speak first. He wore a finely tailored suit, carried a silver-trimmed briefcase, and cradled a bouquet of white orchids. Inside the case, a 30-page recording contract printed in gold ink. Ayanna opened the hotel room door. She didn't smile. She didn't step aside. Her voice was calm, grounded in something far older than her years. "Do you know what a prelude means?" she asked. The man hesitated. I guess it means an introduction?" Ayanna nodded gently. "And then what happened last night wasn't a story. It was just the beginning. And I'm not ready for someone else's name to sit in the middle of it." She closed the door. No press statement, no interviews, no encore. By 4 a.m. the next morning, Ayanna had checked out. One small suitcase, her old white cane and her mother's wooden flute. Professor Harold McCain walked beside her. Professor A.S.M. Hoffpoff, Betty and Julie's mother, walked beside her. Their destination? Salzburg, far from the spotlights. Back at Eastbrook Conservatory, the boardroom sat in stunned silence. An anonymous donor had just pledged $2 million. On one condition: the school must establish a program for artists with disabilities. They must name it the Ayanna Bell Initiative. Clarence Langford sat frozen at the table, a New York Times headline in front of him. She played for 6 minutes. The world listened for 6 million seconds. For the first time in his career, Langford realized he wasn't writing the next chapter. He had been written out of the book. Meanwhile, in a quiet pine cabin in the Salzburg Alps, Ayanna didn't write symphonies. She didn't tour. She didn't say her name. Each morning she walked barefoot through cold grass and sat by the window facing the mountain range, listening. Not for fame, but for truth. "I haven't retreated," she told Harold one morning. "I'm just waiting for the right time to begin chapter 1. Somewhere across the ocean, Nathaniel Royce was still performing, still playing concertos, still standing ovations. But inside, it no longer meant anything. Because after that gala night, he couldn't stop thinking, I played to conquer, she played to save. And she saved me, even though she never saw my face. Then something beautiful began to happen. In a small village at the foot of the mountain, letters began arriving. No return addresses, no logos, no agents, just stories. At first, a few trembling postcards, then envelopes thick with paper, scrawled in pencil or crayon or braille. Ed prisoner in Georgia wrote that every night he tapped on his cell wall, recreating the rhythm of his mother's piano. A week later, a package arrived at the prison. No composer name, just a title. The Wall Remembers. A 10-year-old girl with bone cancer received a sheet titled, "The Breath You Left Behind." When played, it didn't follow traditional notes, but it moved like a dream, fragile and flickering. Her mother clutched her chest and whispered, "I'm still here." A boy with autism used one of Ayanna's pieces as background music for his first YouTube video. What It Feels Like When Words Don't Work. A young woman named Noir, blind since birth, found an untitled page posted to Eastbrook's concert hall door. No name, just a line in braille, for those who were never chosen but still raised their voices. She performed it at her graduation. The entire audience stood, not for applause, but because someone had finally spoken for them. Ayanna never posted anything, never responded publicly. Her reply came as music, handwritten, brown ink on tissue paper, no bar lines, no tempo, no copyright. Each one was a sonic reply to someone else's unspeakable pain. From Salzburg to Paris, from Florence to Kyoto, invitations piled up at her door. She declined them all, until one day, a letter arrived. A gold-rimmed envelope sealed with crimson wax stamped with a heart. Inside, an official invitation from the Royal Council of Arts in London. Ayanna Bell had been selected as the youngest, first blind and first non-conservatory trained musician to receive the Artisan of Sound Award, an honor given once every 10 years to the artist who most profoundly changed how the world hears. Harold placed the letter gently on the wooden table. Ayanna touched the braille at the bottom. She nodded softly. "I'll go, but not to receive." Carry into each other to where it all began, a place where no one needs permission to be heard. The Artisan Award ceremony was held in the hallowed Royal Hall, a space where Benjamin Britten once composed, where Maria Callas once sang, where John Williams once stood. Now it was filled with guests from 94 countries. Above the stage hung a single banner, a night to celebrate what cannot be taught. Ayanna arrived exactly on time. No limo, no entourage, no designer gown, just a dark linen robe, bare feet, her cane, and her mother's wooden flute. She stepped onto the stage not like a star, but like a secret. There was no applause, no spotlight. She bowed. Not to the crowd, but to the ceiling, as if greeting something higher. Something that once whispered to a little blind girl in a forgotten hallway, "You don't need sight to be seen. You don't need permission to be heard." The Artisan Award was a hand-carved crystal sculpture, perched delicately atop a century-old oak pedestal, a symbol of legacy, of mastery, of world-changing sound. Ayanna stepped forward, placed her hand on the cool surface just for a moment. Then gently, reverently, she let it go. She did not take it with her. She did not claim it. No glance at the cameras, no speech, no pose. She didn't need titles. The world had already moved where it needed to be. Then, without a word, she opened the small wooden case and took out the flute her mother once held. Faded, chipped, unadorned. She raised it slowly, as if reviving a buried memory. No orchestra. No microphone, no accompaniment, just breath. She began to play. It was not a familiar melody, not something you could hum, nor track on a sheet of staff paper. The first note barely rose above the sound of her own breathing. Then came a halting series of tones, like a lullaby half sung by a mother too tired to finish. Each note floated like a whisper from another world. Then came the delicate footsteps, the high, uneven notes of those who were never allowed to enter the spotlight. And the entire hall fell still. Not the silence of formality, but the kind of stillness you feel when something ancient and alive has entered the room. Nobody blinked, nobody shifted, even the air felt sacred, suspended in reverence. An elderly musician among the judges whispered tearfully, "She's not playing music, she's restoring it." And when it ended, it didn't end with applause. There was no soaring finale, no victorious chord, just a breathless silence. A silence that felt like a goodbye no one wanted to say aloud. Ayanna bowed her head, returned the flute to its case, and walked away, quietly, as if she had never been there at all. No one moved. No one clapped, because there was nothing left to say. The next morning, every paper across the world carried her image, but not with flashy headlines. Not the new goddess of music. Not a star is born. Just one quiet sentence, repeated everywhere. The silence returned. That very day, the Royal Council met for an emergency session. After 3 hours, they released a single unforgettable statement. Effective immediately, the Artisan Award will be renamed the Ayanna Bell Award, not to honor a person, but to remind us of what has been forgotten. Music is not how we conquer the world. It is how we return to ourselves. And yet, even as her name entered the halls of musical history, Ayanna Bell herself disappeared. No CNN features. No Time magazine covers. No TED Talks. No interviews. She vanished from the spotlight as quietly as she had entered it. But her presence never left. In a riverside town in northern Canada, a whisper passed through the streets. A woman, black, blind, barefoot, taught a nonverbal boy with autism to play music with his feet. She scattered dry rice across the wooden floor. Every step he took made a sound. "That's the first beat," she whispered. For the first time in 9 years of therapy, the boy laughed. In rural Texas, a deaf girl once labeled unfit for music played her first ballad not with notes, but with gloves calibrated to vibrations. When asked by a reporter how she learned, she said, "I didn't learn piano. I learned the feeling of being heard when I couldn't make a sound." No press, no proof. Just stories passed from person to person. When someone asked Professor Harold McCain if the rumors were true, he simply smiled. Before, "Do you need proof? If the sound still echoes in your heart?" Wherever Ayanna appeared, there were no red carpets, no VIP seating, no security barricades. These spaces being made. A church in Nairobi where she taught orphans to write songs using the letters of their names. A nursing home in Kyoto where she listened to elders recount the sounds of their lives, then turned their memories into symphonies. A bus stop in Lisbon, where she left a handwritten song beneath a bench for someone waiting for something they couldn't name. And back at Eastbrook Conservatory, the place that once turned her away, the wind had shifted. They never issued an apology. But the portraits of long-dead composers on the hallway walls were taken down. In their place, a single empty frame. Beneath it, a plaque to set up for distinguishing evidence when her corpse was confirmed. But she taught us. The new curriculum required every first-year student to begin with 1 full hour of silence. No instruments, no scores. Only listening, to the room, to one another, to themselves. One day, a student asked the new director, "Will Ayanna ever come back to receive an honorary degree?" The director didn't answer right away. Then he looked toward the window and said, "You already gave us something greater. She gave us permission. You hear what we've been ignoring all along." At the Royal Artisan Awards, they presented her with a hand-carved crystal statue, resting on a 100-year-old oak pedestal, an heirloom meant to last generations. Ayanna touched it briefly, then she placed it gently back on the stand. She didn't accept it. She didn't speak. She didn't even look toward the cameras. Because titles mean nothing to someone who's already heard the world begin to listen. Instead, she opened a small wooden case and took out the old flute her mother once held. Holding it in both hands, as one would hold memory itself, she began to play. No fanfare, no tempo, no key signature. a note barely above a breath. Then another, like a lullaby interrupted by grief. Notes that sounded like the way mothers hum when holding back tears. Then came a gentle series of tones, lonely, honest, vulnerable. Footsteps in a hall where no one ever opened the door. And the entire hall remained frozen. Not in reverence, in recognition. A single musician, red-mucked, whispered, "She's not playing music. She's restoring it." When she finished, not with a flourish, but with silence so deep it felt like goodbye, she placed the flute back in the case, lowered her head, and walked off stage. No applause, no ovation, no closing words, because some moments are too full for noise. The next morning, every paper printed a single headline. The silence returned. Later that day, the Royal Council of Arts convened. After hours of hushed deliberation, they issued a statement. From this year forward, the Artisan Award will be known as the Ayanna Bell Award, not to celebrate a name, but to remind us of what music was always meant to be. A way to come home to ourselves. She didn't attend the press events. She never claimed the spotlight. There were no follow-up interviews. No magazine features, no touring schedule. She disappeared again, as if she'd never stepped into the light. But everywhere, her presence began to bloom. In a small riverside town in northern Canada, a blind black woman in a wool coat taught an autistic boy to play rhythms with his feet, by scattering rice on the floor. Every crunch underfoot was a beat. Every smile was a song. "That's your first rhythm," she said. The boy laughed, for the first time in 9 years. In Texas, a deaf girl, once told music wasn't for her, used vibration-sensitive gloves to play her first ballad. Not from notes, from feelings. "I didn't learn piano," she said. "I learned what it felt like to be heard, even without sound. No live streams, no confirmations, just stories." When someone asked Professor Harold McCain if the stories were true, he simply replied, "Do you need proof? When the sound is still echoing in your chest?" In Nairobi, she led orphans in writing songs from their names. 1 note per letter. Every child became a melody. In Kyoto, she listened to elders whisper the best sounds of their lives, then turned those memories into symphonies they could pass down. At a Lisbon bus stop, someone found a handwritten song under a bench. It had no title, no composer, just one line. No need to know the name, just follow the echo. In Peru, a blind boy found a Braille music sheet in a traveling library, untitled. The village elder swore no one had brought it in. He played it, then whispered, "I don't see her, but I know she's here." In Ghana, villagers created a rhythm called Ayanna beat. No one taught it to them. They said, "All night, we heard her footsteps before the moon rose." She said nothing. But we heard her anyway. In Syria, during a late-night evacuation at a refugee camp, families reported hearing a flute playing at 3 a.m., gentle, broken, beautiful. In an Icelandic nursing home, a caretaker found a handwritten melody beneath the pillow of a woman who had just passed. No signature, no origin. And back at Eastbrook, where her story once began, the building had changed. Not out of guilt, out of transformation. Bellwing, the new music wing, had no portraits, no velvet ropes, no iron gates. Only a courtyard, a white stone wall, and one line in Braille. Silence is not the absence of sound. It's where everything waits to be heard. No statue of Ayanna Bell, no framed photo. Because her absence had become the loudest thing in the room. During the Bellwing inauguration, Harold McCain, now retired, cane in hand, hair silvered by time, spoke simply. This building is for the kids who were told music wasn't for them. But they never needed permission, because they were always where the sound was born. Royce came too, uninvited. He stood quietly in the back. When he passed by Harold, the old professor nodded. Royce didn't speak. He just took off his sunglasses, stared at the Braille wall, and stayed there, long after everyone else had left. In its first year, Bellwing welcomed over 600 students from around the world, among them 128 had never studied music. 74 were blind, deaf, or neurodivergent. And 41 couldn't read or write, but all of them could feel. One teacher recalled a boy who learned music by placing his ear on a table while a classmate tapped lightly. Each morning, the first track played was not Beethoven, not Bach, just a simple, unnamed recording for those learning to listen to themselves again. At the end, a girl's voice whispered, "If you can hear yourself, you are no longer invisible." No statue was ever made of her, but every heartbeat of every rejected soul began to pulse the way she once did. No tracking system, no sightings, just echoes. And somewhere, on a train, in a village, in the footstep between silence and music, Ayanna Bell is still there. Not to perform, not to lead, but to remind us, music doesn't begin on stage. It begins the moment someone dares to be heard, even when the world expects them to be silent. The sheet music bore no composer's name, just a single line, "For those who have sung, but no one has listened." At Eastbrook Conservatory, now reborn in humility, a freshman once asked his professor, "What if I never play music perfectly? Does that mean I'm not a musician?" The professor looked up from his desk and pointed not to a note, but to the space between two. "Do you hear that silence?" "No," the student answered. "Then you're just about ready." Because the only person who ever truly understood that silence once sat alone outside this very classroom. In New Delhi, Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, Oslo, New Orleans, and Hanoi, quiet music labs began to emerge. Not for performance, not for perfection, for puppet, or for listening. Each class began with 5 minutes of stillness. No instruments, no speaking, no expectation. Then the teacher would ask, "What do you hear?" And that's where the music would begin. Royce, once a giant of the stage, is now an old man in a modest Boston apartment. No crowd, no curtain, just a single piano, unpolished, and a braille sheet he can't read. But every morning he plays from memory, not for applause, but in apology. Once, during a seminar, he asked Harold McCain, "If I rewrote every song I've ever composed, just to make that girl I once rejected feel seen, would it be too late?" Harold smiled. "It's only too late if you refuse to write about what you've lost." Ayanna Bell didn't disappear. She dissolved into the rhythm of the world, into the laughter of children beating tin cans with sticks in alleys, into the breath of someone who's just dared to touch a keyboard for the first time, to the shape of a hand pressed gently against a wooden table, finding music by feel. One winter morning, high in the Bhutanese mountains, a piece of paper was found taped to the door of a tiny temple. No name, no signature, just this: "If you hear something in the silence, it means I was here." And so the girl who was once publicly humiliated for daring to touch a Steinway did not just make the world listen, she taught it how to listen to itself. Ayanna Bell never asked to be remembered. She only wanted one person, just one, to feel like they weren't invisible anymore. And from a whispered insult, from an old wooden flute, from one anonymous song, she changed the way the world listens. And now, we ask you, have you ever heard a melody? Not from sound, but from the deep silence inside your own heart? If so, share it with us in the comments below. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear. If this story moved you, I like it. Share it with someone who needs to feel seen. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next story that speaks not just to your ears, but to your soul. Because some songs aren't meant to be loud. They're meant to echo forever. She music bore no composer's name, just a single line: "For those who have sung but no one has listened." At Eastbrook Conservatory, now reborn in humility, a freshman once asked his professor, "What if I never play music perfectly? Does that mean I'm not a musician?" The professor looked up from his desk and pointed, not to a note, but to the space between two. "Do you hear that silence?" "No," the student answered. then you're just about ready. Because the only person who ever truly understood that silence, when one sat alone outside this very classroom, in New Delhi, Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, Oslo, New Orleans, and Hanoi, quiet music labs began to emerge. Not for performance, not for perfection, but for listening. Each class began with 5 minutes of stillness. No instruments, no speaking, no expectation. Then the teacher would ask, "What do you hear?" And that's where the music would begin. Royce, once a giant of the stage, is now an old man in a modest Boston apartment. No crowd, no curtain, just a single piano, unpolished, and a braille sheet he can't read. But every morning he plays from memory, not for applause, but in apology. Once, during a seminar, he asked Harold McCain, "If I rewrote every song I've ever composed, just to make that girl I once rejected feel seen, would it be too late?" Harold smiled. "It's only too late if you refuse to write about what you've lost." Ayanna Bell didn't disappear. She dissolved into the rhythm of the world, into the laughter of children beating tin cans with sticks in alleys, into the breath of someone who's just dared to touch a keyboard for the first time, into the shape of a hand pressed gently against a wooden table, finding music by feel. One winter morning, high in the Bhutanese mountains, a piece of paper was found taped to the door of a tiny temple. No name, no signature, just this: "If you hear something in the silence, it means I was here." And so the girl who was once publicly humiliated for daring to touch a Steinway did not just make the world listen, she taught it how to listen to itself. Ayanna Bell never asked to be remembered. She only wanted one person, just one, to feel like they weren't invisible anymore. And from a whispered insult, from an old wooden flute, from one anonymous song, she changed the way the world listens. And now, we ask you, have you ever heard a melody, not from sound, but from the deep silence inside your own heart? If so, share it with us in the comments below. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear. If this story moved you, like it, share it with someone who needs to feel seen. Subscribe to our channel, so you won't miss the next story that speaks not just to your ears, but to your soul. Because some songs aren't meant to be loud. They're meant to echo forever. Long after the world moved on, long after the stage lights dimmed and headlines faded into newer names, Ayanna Bell's legacy continued, not as an echo, but as a vibration in the bones of those who once believed they had no right to be heard. In a quiet village outside Kyoto, a child born with no ears placed his hands on a wooden bench and smiled. His teacher, inspired by an untitled piece found scribbled on parchment, said softly, "Can you feel the pause?" The boy nodded, and they began tapping, not to learn rhythm, but to share stillness. No one called it a lesson. It was just listening, the kind Ayanna had once given the world without ever needing the spotlight. This is what remains when the noise dies down. Not applause, not prestige, but compassion, courage, and the subtle power of being present. Ayanna's story teaches us that greatness doesn't always wear a medal or hold a microphone. Sometimes it walks barefoot across cold floors, carrying only a flute and the memory of a mother's lullaby. Her journey was never about claiming space. It was about creating space for others. In a world that often glorifies volume and overlooks the quiet ones, Ayanna reminded us that silence, too, is sacred. That music isn't in the notes alone, but in the spaces between them. That the most profound art isn't performed to impress, it's lived to connect. What do we learn from Ayanna? We learn that dignity has no prerequisites. That a blind black girl with no pedigree can humble an entire industry simply by being honest. That empathy is a skill worth teaching, perhaps the only one that makes us truly human. And that somewhere someone is still waiting to hear, "You are not invisible." More than anything, we learn that hope does not shout, it whispers. It whispers through a prison wall where fingers tap out forgotten memories. It whispers through braille on a sheet of music sent without a name to a mother grieving in the dark. It whispers through a flute in the dead of night, played not for crowds, but for the broken. And in every whisper, we are reminded, our humanity is not measured by the spotlight we stand in, but by the light we offer others. So, to those who've ever felt unchosen, unseen, unheard, Ayanna's journey is not just a story. It's a hand outstretched through the silence, not to pull you up, but to remind you you never needed permission to begin. All it takes is one note, one breath, one act of courage to start. The rest will echo forever.